Hello, wholehearted people. I'm so glad you're here because you belong here. As always, I'm Abby, this is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's what I know. Everything in our social worlds is created through communication. That's the stories we tell, the way we show up to each other, the patterns that we find ourselves in. And if we can take the time to understand this, then we can start changing our communication and making better social worlds for ourselves. Today we have part 2 of our conversation with Aline Mugisho. If you haven't gotten the chance to listen to part 1 yet, I will suggest you go back and start there. We really got to know and understand Aline and her story in part 1. We learned about the kind of society that Aline grew up in and the way those community narratives shaped her. And we just started talking about the lack of opportunity and innovation that are keeping African agriculture stagnated in Aline's eyes. At the end of that conversation, you will remember that Aline was explaining the challenges that young people specifically face when trying to enter into agricultural work. Today, we're continuing that conversation by hearing more about Aline's work at the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, or IITA, as you will hear us call it, and how she is working towards that better world through building relationships and giving people the space to tell their stories, much like we are doing here. I really loved this conversation with Aline. I got a lot out of it, and I hope that you can as well. I think her perspective is a really good one for us to hear as we are looking to create our own better social worlds and take a look at our own stories. Remember that you are just as much a part of this conversation as me or Aline, and that us getting to hear her story is a great honor and privilege, and it matters how we receive her story. So get ready to be vulnerable with us and to enter into this conversation. So with that, let's begin.
So it's this pattern that you're seeing of there's no jobs for the young people because the older people aren't leaving their jobs. And then the other option of them trying to be entrepreneurial and get funding for whatever other creative projects is also not an option because no one wants to invest in them.
Not that no one wants to invest. You have some angel donors and so on and so forth, but it's very minimal, right? The support is very minimal because the youth need even to get training. Most of the youth in many places, those that grew up in the rural areas or survived through agriculture, they don't want to do agriculture because it was so difficult. It's not mechanized, right? It's not industrialized. It's traditional farming. So that level of labor and suffering is not something they want to do. They want to run away from the sector as much as they can. Those that who are in town, they have no sense, no idea on how that goes, right? They've never been exposed to it. So you need to train them, to kind of reframe their mindsets. Then they want to start their businesses in that. Once they have acquired the skills, you need to help them to understand what the business looks like. Make them meet with the investors. The investors, they don't see the relevance of who they are to their own big enterprises, especially those who are in big companies. There's no connection. Okay, you now look at the primary production. Is the only people who have a slight chance, those young people who can really produce from the farm to the market, because they could produce raw material if they follow good technologies, if they follow good agronomical practices and so on. But what happens for those who want to do processing? No bank is willing to do that for them. If you say these ones, they prefer a machine that will help them to transform banana plantain into chips, nobody's gonna easily take that, If you say somebody wants to just create a packaging company so that whoever is trying to make bananas, they want to reduce the loss, this one will make sure that they're well conserved and preserved and packaged so they don't get wasted. The size and the number of those people will be very minimal.
With your work, where does your work enter in with the youth in the agriculture here?
So my work is basically to challenge all that system in many ways and in both ends, to make sure that there is enough public sensitization that agriculture does not end with primary production. There's broader ways in which you can look into the product development, right? You can create dry fruit, you can create paste. There's so many values you can add to a single product.
Okay, yeah.
We train the youth to do that, right? We are preparing the youth to become the next industry drivers of agriculture. So moving from that only old traditional ways of doing farming into a more industrial development so the industry can develop. Mechanization, and also link them to investors. Trying to show the bank or the banks or the finance institution what is the importance of having a young workforce, young businesses develop, and how does that impact the lives of those? Because in Africa here, a smallest family has at least 3 people, a mother and 2 children. There was a study conducted by the World Bank that says an average family in Africa has at least 5 people in a household. In those 5 people, it could be that the father does not work or the mother does not work, or one of the parents works, but they earn very little. So a young person who has finished school, starting to have a good business and a good income, they are more likely to impact at least 4 people's lives, right? And support better livelihood. That means if a bank would even use that logic into funding young people's business, they will be creating 5 new customers with accounts that will be maintained. If we look at just the maintenance of those accounts, the bank would have made its profit back. So we help them to access finance, we negotiate those, we're developing new models, access to finance models and so on, to make sure that young people have access to those resources. And my work recently, I was telling my mom, is to make sure that there is also a bridge way through that. That bridge is about making sure that young people that we create also alternative models that are not from the bank, by having sub-activities that may be reinvested back into agriculture, branding, sewing, vocational, trainings that can still help young people both add value again to the agri product, but also to access income in a way that will help them at least build a profile. Because the bank wants to see a profile. Like in the US, if you don't have a credit record, you cannot borrow, right? So the bank too want to see a profile. They want to see that business has started somewhere. They have managed to do their bookkeeping. They can manage a certain amount of money before they can trust them with their money, So how do you do that is to create alternative means. This is the beginning of the process that I am doing. The second thing is to merge the needs of the investors through a growth talk, I call it. Make sure investors understand the need of having competition on the market, a broad market diversity that provide them with a wide range of products, but also for the industry to have the labor that is required. I don't do only businesses. I also train people to take up jobs in agricultural sector. We do that through the Youth in Agribusiness program of IITA. So it is really basically about that youth inclusion, economic inclusion, but through the agricultural sector, and making sure that we're developing a new employment system that does not fully depend only on jobs available, but also on the creation of those jobs.
Yeah, so it sounds like if the system is, not conducive to promoting innovation, your role in your work is about coming in and creating the space for that innovation and finding new ways to do things.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm so curious to hear your perspective on, why is this the route, to equity? Why sustainable agriculture? Because
sustainable agriculture, cuts across a lot of areas. The first way into making sure that you have a good food secure society is to have diversity food production systems. The second way in making sure that society is not as vulnerable as it could is to make food accessible and affordable to people. The third way, the only way to make sure that you have children that are having a nutritious diet is to make sure that the food is produced in a way that it preserves the highest vitamins and nutritious values so that they can be able to access that food. And that quality food impacts their performance in school and their health and so on and so forth. The other thing is the economic struggles that many people are having is basically linked to the cost of living. And the cost of living is felt strongly and deeply when you go to the supermarket to buy a bag of rice or potatoes and onion, and you realize that your bills have strongly changed. So by making food production an industrialized food system, it means that we have less likelihood to have hungry people because the food production is abundant enough to feed all the people. Look at the level of people who die with hunger daily in our world. It's a shame. And youth can easily contribute to that. Because when they produce, they don't produce only for local market, they can also produce for international market. Or once they have produced enough for the local market, it can also, spread through to international market. It's a gross process in each business that is created, isn't it? So hunger is being tackled. And if we don't have a very hungry society, maybe we can start talking about the angry society that we have had and the frustrated society that we are developing. And it's a way to justice. If you don't have hungry people, you will not struggle with people going to ask for justice, to seek justice. People are silenced because they cannot have the minimum.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if those people have the minimum, they will fight for a better system. And that, the larger part of that group in Africa are young people, young men and young women. Now, if those people have a better income, they can access better education. If those people have a better education, they will have a critical sense of what they deserve in terms of leadership. They will evaluate the society in which they live and can eliminate a lot of things, including corruption, malfunction, societal challenges that are already creating terrorists today. So if you think of why sustainable agriculture is the way to go, think a world without food.
Yeah, I'm convinced. Even if I could, before you explained all that, use my imagination to think of all the things that root back to the agriculture of a community or a society, I could have come up with, a number of things, but it really is everything. You could tie back to that, it seems like what you've done. And yeah, I'm sure, there's many ways forward to be fighting for justice. You need people on all fronts. Do you see do other people understand this connection like you do, or is it something you have to kind of convince people of, that agriculture is the center of all of this?
I think a lot of more people are starting to understand that. I was talking to a few farmers in the US and some professors, or even to the government last October. And I got to realize that the issue of having an aging labor force in agriculture is not only an African issue, it's a global issue. Nobody wants to take employment in that sector because nobody has ever really unpacked the sector.
Yeah.
People don't think of an agricultural fintech company, yet digital agriculture in Asia contributes away so much to their economy. And we all consume that. Frozen food has saved so many lives, right?
Yeah.
And you cannot discuss that. You cannot sit there and say gender equality if you cannot give somebody enough to even feed their own children. Okay, now we're not asking anybody to give somebody enough to give their own children. We're just telling people that we need to make sure that this waste is mitigated, is managed enough, And in managing that waste, we're creating more employment, we're creating more income secure society, we're creating more livelihood, we're creating a more nutritious environment for young people in school and at work. We're creating a more secure society with mothers and fathers who don't have to worry about what their children are going to eat. We're creating less worries by occupying these young people into productive activities that would reduce their vulnerability to recruitment into terror and insurgent movement. In an actual sense, we're creating a new economic force.
Yeah, it's like if the better social world is all of those things you just listed, then you're going back and fulfilling that basic need to make sure that people can be alive to be a part of that better social world in the first place. Because that need is not maybe currently being met the way it needs to be.
Yeah. I'm not from an agricultural background. It wasn't until recently when I joined IITA that I learned about the technologies being developed. I learned about the improved varieties of seeds. I learned about opportunities, my brain is very wired. I am a very active person in my brain. Like I can see one thing and I already know 10 things I will do with this one thing I've just seen. I can link, I can create those connections without thinking,
Yeah.
And these women, these young boys and girls who are looking for jobs every day, jobs that will give them not even enough to fulfill 10% of their needs, could look into the hope of creating something else by contributing. But that's only the one side of the story. The other side is somebody needs to be receptive enough to take those services. Somebody needs to trust them enough to offer them those contracts. They need to be trained and well-disciplined enough to develop that business mindset. And if they cannot be given respect, they need to be trained enough to claim the respect. And we can record the impact. We can understand how impactful the work we do is contributing to a better society and the better social world that we want to have. So it's about that understanding of where can I go? What can I do? And of course, some people say, but you're still deciding for these young people. No, it's different. In this sense, you are opening a window opportunity that they never thought existed. And as I said, there is an industry, an entire industry that can be developed. A transformation agenda. Food is, Africa has vast lands, waters, young workforce. These young people, if they get the necessary labor they require, even multinationals that are food producers, they will not be worrying about the cost of human resources because they need to export, because they need to import skills into the country. The food exchange and the food channel in which people can really, we're all struggling for a good diet today. Half of the things that we suffer from can be dealt with really with a very healthy, good diet. It is the revolution on its own. To make sure that people can understand that I don't need to expect an income. I can be the income. I can make the income. You work for yourself, right? So you understand a bit the struggle of kicking down a company, getting enough contracts, enough clients, enough of things that need to be done. It takes a huge discipline, courage, and so on. But now imagine if you were doing all that in a society that doesn't even believe you can do anything.
Yeah. Yeah, to try to advocate for yourself when you feel like you're standing alone because there's nothing built in to support you.
Yeah. And what I love about my work at IITA is I have access to powerful people, governments, UN, and so on and so forth. So when that happens, when I see them, we can link them to what the youth are doing. They can do exhibition. They can express themselves. They can tell them the challenge they have. And then we can have that intergenerational gap closed down very slowly. And I feel like our product, whether it is food or other things, need to get out there. What about the women who are making something like what I'm wearing right now? Very proudly women men. And the men who are doing the same. Branding, marketing. You produce something like this as a gift, but just look at the society of packing and wrapping gifts in the US alone in Christmas time. It's huge, no?
Yeah.
How sustainable can it get unless we start to reorganize ourselves in a way that can really give us a chance to reduce that level of waste? If I can give you something like this to wrap your gifts, and you can take it to the next person to wrap their gift, and they can take it to the next person to wrap their gift, we're already reducing the cost of production. And that means that we have less labor. We have less electricity being used somewhere. Carbon emission.
I think what's so striking to me about the work that you're doing is that it has this really intimate, present focus of, empowering these individuals and changing their lives. And at the same time, looking to the future and having this focus on the longevity, the sustainability of these new systems that you're working to create. I think there's a lot of value in something that, can be both of those things.
Yeah. It's basically looking at both ends, Before you feel the middle, you hold the rope from both ends.
Mm-hmm.
And you start slowly seeing how the middle can feel to make sure that the rope is hanging properly. And partly, that can only happen if we look at it from the perspective of making sure that those people have access to a free, world where they can really use their imagination and understanding into creating income-generating activities that are not necessarily driven or dictated by us as an NGO. Because I don't tell people what business to create.
Yeah.
I mean, if I see a business opportunity and want to share it with the youth, I will share it with the youth. They want to create it, then I will see the requirement to create that business and come and teach the youth to do it. These are the requirements, and this is where you get there. This is how you get there.
Yeah.
Build their capacity enough. Once they have gotten there, we'll give them continuous mentorship. Because it takes 1 to 3 years for a business to survive. How best can they do that? And now recently I'm looking at the linkages between the Western world and the world here. How best can we create those channels?
Yeah, you're leading me into a good segue because I was going to say, it's a communication podcast. I can't end this conversation without talking about the communication, the relationships that you're engaged in. And so, what does it look like for you? How are you mindful or intentional about how you build relationships in, your personal family life, but also in your work with the people you serve, powerful people you said you're trying to connect those people to? What does that look like?
It's a natural process for me. I build relationship by not putting ranks between people. The only ranks that's operating in my life is the good people and the bad people. And I don't judge the bad people, but I also don't want to associate with them.
Sure.
At the same time, sometimes are trying to create an environment where they can tell their side of the story. Because there's a danger to a single story.
Absolutely.
How do I make my relationships? For me, I make my relationship around the people who believe, in a better world. The people who are hungry for a just society. The people who have compassion enough to understand that I cannot take another free breath until I end the inequality happening behind my door.
Mm.
That's how I believe relationship. That's how intentional I get into my relationships. There are also those that I feel have a better platform than me, who can pass this message on better than I can, or who have access to people that can make those decisions that I cannot make. But there are also those investors, those companies that are stagnating because they don't have either the right labor, or they don't have the right products, or they don't understand because things have been disrupted, or the high cost, increase in cost of fuel also is challenging their growth process. Now I'm like, I have these young people here. They can come up with some wonderful innovations. Or they already have innovations in this sector. They want to explore this in partnership or alone and see what it will bring us. And as I said recently, with the finance institution, is about building a new product and model. The current model doesn't simply work. We need to understand that there is a new model that needs to be created. And those who have made a lot of money, they need to come back and give back to the society in a productive way.
Mm-hmm.
Not in a way that makes them look good.
Yeah.
But in a way that we can really see that there's an intention, a good intention, an impactful intention behind the gesture.
Yeah.
I was telling somebody that the work that we do can destroy or build depending on how we use it. Both are tools we have at hand. How do we use them? Social world, to me, means a world where we can better understand the vulnerability of another person without them saying a word.
Mm.
If they can't say words to me, and I can tap into their world and invite them into a middle ground, because nothing says that my world is better than their world. But even in that silence, there are things that are so loud, as you've said. The injustice around the world is one of those. The hunger around us is one of those. And all those people, they only have one wish: a better tomorrow. And I'm not saying that I'm going to change that by making a better tomorrow, but I will bring my very tiny difference in whichever way I can, and I will not rest until that difference is felt and can influence others to do the same. If they cannot do the same, then there's no meaning to my work. I don't even work to earn a salary. I work to make an impact.
Yeah.
So if that impact is being created, I have no fear that I will never die of hunger. If those youth are creating good employment, I will have a job no matter what. Because there's a way in which when we give, we receive.
I can see that you are helping so many people to write a new story for themselves because, like you, like me, they surely grew up with different stories that told them what they could and couldn't be or could and couldn't do. And I see your work as, offering a new story. And I agree with you that there is a lot of danger in a single story. And that's part of the whole idea around what are the stories we live? What are the stories we tell? But in between those, there are these untold stories and these unheard stories. And it's about the space that has been created in a society that specifically put down certain stories or, given privilege to other stories. And so I see, your work through that lens. You're telling me a new story today. So what is something that you would want people like me, people who are outside looking in, to know about your work or your community or the people that you serve?
They're resilient. Definitely consider, I really love the choice of the words that you picked. I consider myself as their servant. I just want to tell those that are around me and those in the far, wide distance that there are bridges to be made, to be built. If I'm struggling through a bank, another angel donor somewhere have enough resources that could help this youth, these young people, prove a point, if I may call it like that, because the world is about proving points. It's not like they don't have a case. They have a good case, but they're not proving a point. And because they're not proving a point, their profile is not worthy enough to look at. They are not compliant with society's rules and regulations of what success is and what a trustworthy person is or looks like. That on its own is the level of vulnerability that we need to reassess. The people I work with are inspirational. They inspire me. They are courageous. They're resilient. They're strong. They can also be weak. They are suppressed, but they can also be a force. So my work, my world evolves around creating that level of economic freedom for young people so that they can feel useful to the society and eventually inspired enough to build a better society than the one that they grew up in. It is that narrative shifts, it's that paradigm shifts that my work evolves around.
Thank you for sharing that. I think you've kind of already answered my, ending question of, what is a better social world and what do we do to get there? Because I think, it seems like you live and breathe working towards that better social world.
I think it's also one that connects, that is coherent, that is consistent, and the one that is inviting. There is so many pockets of exclusions that happen across the world. There is the us and them that constantly reinforces those injustice that happens, consciously or unconsciously. And I love the fact that you spoke about the stories lived, the Lutz model, as we call it in CMA. It's a model that have taught me to understand stories from very multiple perspectives. There are those that are untellable.
Yeah.
There are those that have been told, and there's those that we need to be telling to be able to look into the needs of those people and then build achievable small steps that can help that is the growth process through which I would like to understand social world.
And it seems like you already have a great understanding of the collaboration that has to be a part of that. That you said this space, what the better social world is in, one big invitation. And you exist right in that work of connecting people to each other and being a part of this collaboration that has to happen because we don't exist in a bubble. Nothing, no story, no person is independent of every other thing.
We need to contextualize that into a way that slowly maps us toward a timeline. And I would even call it an hierarchy of action. We need that hierarchy to be able to evaluate ourselves every now and again. And that goes back to the initial question of when do you check in with yourself?
Yeah.
I think at some point we also get lost into the passion and the bubbles of thinking that we got it all figured.
Yeah.
And we fail to humble ourselves enough to the opportunities to learn more.
Yeah. Well, I think my last kind of question that I am trying to leave the listeners of the podcast with is, what's our next turn? And that, comes from the CMM language. You're talking about the context. What comes before, what comes after? How is this all one turn following another? And so I wonder what, we could come up with for people that are listening to the podcast of, what is their next turn? What can they take away from this conversation? And I wonder if it's that, like you said, going back to the very beginning of their conversation, is it finding space to reflect, to enter into your internal world, to get away from the noise? Or if you have a different idea of, what our next turn could be?
No, I think our next turn could be summarized into a focused point. And I think that focus point can easily also connect to CMM's verification point. There must be that intersection in which we can define a better social world that links to the realities of those around us, close or far. The compassion in understanding that the world is a big struggle, one way or the other. Satisfaction comes from the ability of fulfilling your deepest desire. What about satisfaction coming from the ability of contributing to building a better society, a better world? I think for my work, the next turn for those listening to me, and I am totally open, is what can you do to help these young people that I work with? How can you help these young people create a better world?
That's a great one. Aline, those are all the questions I have for you. I feel like that's been a pretty natural arc to our conversation, but I do just want to give you one last chance if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about or share today.
No, I think I'm very happy to have been and privileged to have had this platform to discuss this. CMM is a life-changing discovery for me.
Me too.
I can only imagine this level of communicating, spreading to the work that I do in businesses and so on daily. I'm wondering how best transmitting this level of communication, tools to the young people can even help them in their marketing and connecting, and improving their social world. That would be very useful.
Yeah, I think that's my whole, purpose for the podcast is that understanding CMM and having it as a lens, as a perspective to view everything in my life through was so helpful and empowering to me. And even, I studied interpersonal communication. So, CMM was one of the theories I came across, and not everybody gets to study it, gets to, dedicate their life or study to that like some people do. But that, that doesn't mean that everyone shouldn't still have access to this information, because in that same kind of vein of, you have to have the goal of creating a better social world. It's like, what good does this information or these perspectives have if they're just something I read about in my textbook and not something that all the people that actually do communicate every day and are the ones out there trying to create something better, if they don't understand it, if they don't get to actually put it to use.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that is all for our conversation with Aline, and I just think it was a really meaningful conversation for us to be a part of because, like I said, the name of the podcast is Stories Lived, Stories Told, which isn't the whole story on its own. The implication there that I'm hoping you hear when you hear the name of the podcast is that our stories exist on this kind of spectrum, I guess, and in between these two ends, the stories lived and the stories told, are all these other kinds of stories. And we have to acknowledge that those stories exist, first of all, and then we have to seek them out and, find ways to tell our own untold stories, even when they're hard to tell or we don't know how to tell them. And we have to find ways to expose ourselves to stories that we haven't heard, either because they're not our own stories or because there's bigger forces at play keeping us from hearing those stories. So for me, this story that Aline is sharing is one of those stories that I just haven't heard before. And what it does for me is to help expand my understanding of the world of stories, and it's just adding layers and more depth. And I just think that's really beautiful. Today, our next turn, like we said, is to find that time to reflect with yourself. That goes back to something we talked about at the very beginning of part 1 of our conversation, that it's so important to step away from the noise because it's part of what better equips us to make real change in our social worlds. Because when we have the perspective and the energy to be able to take on that work, the things we do will be more effective, more creative, more imaginative. And it's really hard work to do. That's why we need that rest and that space to gain perspective. Aline knows that. She lives that. Aline also mentioned considering how we can help with her work and the people that she serves. And even if you don't feel like you are able to affect that work directly, I think what we can take from that is rethinking how we approach the help we offer. She mentioned that intersection between the better social world and what the reality is for people. Like, maybe we have this really grand idea of what the best social world looks like for somebody else, but if we don't take the time to know them, to really know them, their stories, the values, the history, the bigger context they exist in, then our help is much less effective and meaningful. So I guess with all of that, the question that I want to leave you with is, how can you seek out a new story this week? How can you deepen your understanding of someone? And how can you find ways to, like Aline does, serve people in the way that they actually need instead of what what you think they need? I think these are good things to be thinking about and playing with. Next week is actually our last episode of season 1. I can't believe it. I am in shock. It's exciting that this has already been a whole year. It'll be a mini-sode, just me and you, hopefully a good way to reflect on this year, all the things we've shared and learned, and wrap everything up nicely. And I'm excited to officially share that I will be returning for a season 2 in 2023. We will pick back up with episodes starting in early February, and in the meantime, I'll be working on some exciting other projects to expand the world of Stories Lived, Stories Told, and start having those new conversations that you'll get to hear next year. As always, I get to do this podcast with the support from the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. We share those same goals of reflecting on communication, learning from the power of storytelling, and working to make better social worlds. I'll link their website in the description, and I will definitely encourage you to go check out all the awesome things that they are doing over there. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone who could use it. Again, this is an ever-expanding community, a welcoming community, and we want it to be one big invitation into people. Everybody and every story is welcome in this space, so be an invitation to someone into this community. And please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's super helpful for me, get more people connected to the podcast, which is the goal. Follow us wherever you may be listening so you never miss an episode. And of course, I'm always available to reach through email at storieslived.storiestold@gmail.com. Again, that's storieslived.storiestold@gmail.com. I love to keep the dialogue alive with you. I am happy to hear any of your questions or ideas for the podcast or any stories that you want to share of your own. Thank you so much for showing up today. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. So that's all for today, for me, but not for you. So keep creating mindful moments. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.